Hello, everybody. Hopefully, you're hanging in there. What I thought I would do, if you haven't seen the extra credit assignment, I did post that recently. But what I thought I'd do over the next several days, that we're all kind of in this same situation, is just give you kind of a brief discussion, I guess, or update on a couple of books that I read that I think would be relevant to think about maybe and to use to engage in some future discussion in class. I may be able to make these part of assignments that we do too. But it's a book called Them, written by Ben Sasse, and another book called The World is Flat by Thomas Friedman. The authors come from completely different perspectives politically, yet they've both written books that have been kind of supported, lauded, affirmed by both sides of the political spectrum to varying degrees. So I thought it would be kind of cool to look at what their arguments were and are, and maybe just food for thought to think about that and how it might apply to what we're going to be doing when we get back, which hopefully will be relatively soon. But it's a good opportunity the next couple of weeks actually to kind of do some different things with your time. I actually don't mind this that much because I love to read. I love to, kind of do that. And then I'm also learning how to use this new YouTube stuff and post my own videos and things like that. So I think it can add to what we do in class quite a bit. And one of the things that I'll do is I'm going to kind of go through a couple chapters at a time as quick as I can. They're two completely different books, but they kind of complement each other in another way. The first one, Ben Sasse is a senator from Nebraska. He wrote a book called Them. And the book centers on the inability that we currently have in our culture to disagree without kind of name calling, without becoming really divisive, without separating into two separate camps. And the goal of him writing the book is maybe look at how the problem got started, where it came from, and maybe how to fix it. And the first thing he brings up is the idea here that we are very connected as a global society, more connected than we'll ever be in the past, have ever been in the past. That 1/4 of the world's population today is on Facebook. So think about that. 2 billion people can connect with each other on Facebook. And certainly there's other social media apps and platforms, but 1/4 of our world's population is on Facebook, bringing that idea of connectedness to an all-time high. And part of this is because of the technology advancements we've had. So computers at the height of the Cold War. So depending on how you view the height of the Cold War, that period of tension between us and primarily the Soviet Union, but really between democracy and communist forces. At the height of that, those computers that were available then and were approximately the size of the THS gymnasium, if you can imagine that, so big the computers were. Those computers only have 2% of what's capable that's right on your phone in your pocket today. All right, so that's how much we've advanced. So the device that you have is 98% more capable and effective than what they had during the Cold War era in this country. And again, that computer took up the size of the THS gym. Also, there's more computing aptitude on a digital washer machine today than there was used to put a man on the moon in 1969. That's how quickly things have kind of progressed in our society. Yet, despite all this interconnectedness, we see that our population in some ways is more isolated than ever. Just as of a couple of years ago, for 3 years in a row, the life expectancy in the United States actually declined, which is bizarre when you think of the ideas that we've had these great advancements in medical technology and medical advancement. Yet why is it that we see a 3-year continuous decline in life expectancy in this country? Well, they've really looked at 3 factors that have led to this. One of them being an increase in Alzheimer's, another one being an increase in the number of suicides, which is very disturbing, and then the third one being accidental deaths, which primarily, most of which refers to alcohol or drug-induced overdoses. So despite all of this connectivity, researchers and commentators have looked at this and said, well, what's the real problem? Despite being so connected, we seem to be so isolated. at the same time. Um, Also, the other thing that happens, and I'm sure you're aware of, and you picked up on this, is when people do have disagreements, it goes from 0 to 10 very quickly. So Senator Sasse, living in Nebraska, brings up the fact that while he opens and welcomes disagreement on political issues, he's actually had his property vandalized. He's had blood thrown on his door. He traditionally has helped out in a marathon race over the years as part of community service, where the whole community kind of came together and helped out to hand out water at races and things like that. And he noticed a shift in kind of the attitude about disagreement over political issues when, as he was handing out water with his family, there was a group of people across from where he was handing out water, accusing him of giving poison to the runners. So they were yelling to the runners, "Don't drink it, it's poison," as kind of a way to get back at him or to kind of attack his political leanings. And one of the things that he brings up that I think is interesting in urban combat training, they've looked at the idea that human beings, say that you're faced with a threat 50 yards away, so half the football field at THS. So think of somebody threatening you, maybe with, I don't know, some sort of device or something like that that you view as a threat. If somebody comes closer to you, within, say 5 yards even, your attention automatically will shift to that closer threat, even if that closer threat is not as deadly or as dangerous as the one that's 50 yards away. The way we're made up as humans, we will immediately, our focus will go to that closer threat, even if it's not as important. So he uses this to kind of say, a lot of times that may be what goes on in political debates today, that it's much easier to lash out at the individual or person that's near us, rather than kind of deal with the bigger issue, which may may be very difficult to solve. It's much easier to attack the person or the belief system of the person that's near you. He also, and so as far as the solution goes, one of the things that he has seen over the years that's missing, and actually the Waterbury Republican or Republican American's the name of the newspaper, but it ran an article a couple weeks ago talking about this very idea. And he said what's missing now is that hometown Friday night gymnasium feeling. And what he means by that is when he grew up, whether you were in elementary school or middle school, a lot of people went to the high school gym on a Friday night to see the basketball team play. And that whether you were young, old, no matter what you may not even have liked the people in your community that much, but that Friday night gym feeling was where everybody kind of came together and realized, at least for those moments that the game was being played, that you were all part of the same team. So when you did have political disagreements or something like that, you still viewed each other as human beings, and even with a lot in common, and relied upon one another in a certain context as well. And used to see, little fourth graders or fifth graders kind of dribbling a basketball on the side, and thinking what it was going to be like maybe when they got to high school and could wear those colors. But so much of that is gone now. Gyms are empty on Friday nights and on the weekends, and sometimes that has to do with the win-loss record of the team. But he said even when he grew up, that really didn't matter, that people would still show up and kind of cheer everybody on. And so now people tend to stay away and tend to be isolated in their own worlds. The other thing that he brings up is this idea of loneliness, that despite the amount of connectivity that we have today, we're a very lonely culture. And one of the things that stood out for him was in 1995, there was a tremendous heat wave in July of 95 in Chicago. And 739 people died in this heat wave. The temperature was like 106 degrees, but the heat index was like 120. And these were apartment buildings where people didn't have air conditioning and things like that. And so they died. But the question came up, how can a city that has millions of people in it get to a point, over 2 million people, where you have 739 people die in your city? And a lot of it was they would find them later. So people would pass away in their apartments and they wouldn't be discovered maybe for weeks at a time. And some really kind of, less than stellar circumstances to think about. well, how did this happen? And what they figured out, because at first people said, well, maybe it was race, maybe it was poverty, people didn't care about these people, they were poor. But really it wasn't that. What they discovered was that it was about the amount of social connections they had. So in the areas where people had lived together for a while, they had developed these bonds, so they would at least check on one another, and they knew the comings and goings of each other, throughout a daily, whatever schedule. A lot of the people that they found that passed away that nobody checked on were in areas where there had been, large businesses that had left Chicago, or maybe service industries of some kind that had kind of left. And so what was left behind were people that really didn't have social connections with one another. They were forgotten, they were lonely, they were by themselves. And over 700 of these types of people died in the city of Chicago during the 90s. So even though we're tremendously connected, it's amazing that there's still a good number of people that feel, lonely and isolated despite all this connectivity. It was in the 90s when it was discovered that more people bowled. So if you've ever gone bowling, in the 90s, there was kind of a spike in the number of people that said that they bowled. The sad thing was, though, the number of bowling leagues actually declined. So you had people bowling more than ever, and yet the leagues interacting with one another in a league actually declined. So it was called Bowling Alone, was kind of the article that came out talking about that. Likewise, there were there was a huge decline in the number of people that belonged to organizations like the Rotary Club in town. We have one right in Torrington, which is really about small businesses and businesses coming together to support one another in that endeavor. The Kiwanis Club and some others. A tremendous decline in the number of people that would be involved in those organizations, which for a long time have been viewed as a pillar of a community, of keeping everything kind of going and supporting one another, and things like that. And so the division in society is causing more and more people to be isolated and not work together for common problems. He then goes into something that the Brookings Institute discovered, and it was part of the division that we see in society. There is really a division today, and you've heard enough of this in politics about wealth, the haves and the have-nots, the wealthy and those that are not as wealthy or even poor. And the Brookings Institute discovered that there was really three categories that are controversial and maybe oversimplistic too, because there's a lot of variety of reasons for poverty. It doesn't always go back to these three things, but they did see a trend. And they said that there was basically three things that if you do these things, you will be much, much less likely to live a life of poverty and are more likely to succeed and to kind of flourish in society. The first one is to finish high school, which is pretty obvious today when you look at who employers want to hire and job opportunities and things like that. The second one is to get a job, any job. It doesn't need to be your dream job. Just start working, and things will start happening. Resume starts getting built. You maybe have an open door to another job that you do like, an experience that you need for a career. So finish high school, get a job, any job. And the third one is that the Brookings Institute discovered was to make sure that you're married before you have children. That kind of single motherhood and poverty tend to go hand in hand, which is the third characteristic that they said. If you can avoid that and do the other two things, you're going to at least set yourself up for a greater chance that you will not live a life of poverty. Again, not without controversy, but it is what the Brookings Institute discovered. And so the one thing that Sasse brings up here and uses that, and Sasse is a conservative, but yet the Brookings Institute is more of a liberal organization. So there's a lot of agreement between the sides here in a lot of this, which is interesting, and I think it's worth looking at. Anytime politically we can have agreement on something, I think it's worth looking at what that is, because we see so much division in our culture today. But really the impact of the family upon the structure of society and the implications that we've had to face as a society. So the first part of his book, discovering part of the problem. We're more connected than ever, but we're also lonelier than ever. Um, and this idea of social loneliness. And part of what happens with the loneliness aspect is how would we, how do you define loneliness? And so a lot of times loneliness is looked at as kind of a taboo thing that people don't admit to. They're much more willing to tell you that they're depressed than they are to tell you that they're lonely. But loneliness by social scientists has really been defined as losing connection, feeling that you've lost connection, purpose with the greater world, that you can essentially be around a lot of people but still be lonely. And but people don't like the stigma of that. They don't want to admit that that's actually what they're feeling. And what they've discovered is, especially with elderly males, are the most susceptible in the country, 4 times more likely than females to kind of feel this way. And part of that is because they stop gaining new social or friendships, I guess, after the time when they get married, have a job, start a career, start a family. They tend to, for whatever reason, not enter into new friendships with people. And so when those things unfortunately go away as they get older or decline or kind of, whatever life circumstances happen, they can become very lonely. And that increases their likelihood of disease and actually shortens their lifespan. They've seen a connection between that and health. So loneliness definitely is, a major factor that we see influencing people today. We see the massive spikes in drug addiction and things like that. They've looked at the feelings that you get from friendship, from love, from significant others. What happens in your body chemically is as strong as what people will take into their bodies through opiates to get that feeling, the same feeling. So the emotions that we're dealing with here are pretty significant. So that's kind of what I want to look at just for today with Sasse's book on them. Is there a way that we can stop the loneliness that's happening, despite the idea that we are so connected and more so than ever, that we almost push each other away when we see disagreements and differences of opinion. And the question he kind of leaves everybody with is, how can we recreate that feeling of community, maybe, despite our differences, that might, kind of bridge these gaps and kind of bring people back together in a way that would help. So that's the first book I wanted to talk about. That's basically the first 2 chapters. The other book is The World is Flat by Sasse and Friedman, a writer for the New York Times. Has written several books, virtual bestsellers the minute they come out. Certainly worth reading and getting into. But he uses the analogy, the reason he called his book The World is Flat is he talked about Christopher Columbus basically running into North America thinking it was India, or this part of the world thinking it was India. And the idea that several years ago he went to India and thought he was in the United States of America, which he did not expect. Not so much, geographically or some of those other things, but the way that they lived and the changes that he saw in their workplace, and some of those other things. And that basically what he means by that the world is flat is that the playing field has been leveled today. Okay, so what I mean by that is computer technology has created a platform where intellectual work can be done anywhere. I'm doing this despite us being in something of a quarantine, I guess. I can do this through the computer in my home. Likewise, you can do the same thing. You can text people no matter where you're at. It kind of has freed us up as a society in a lot of ways. You've probably heard this whole infatuation that we have with globalization. It's not a new thing. Friedman basically looks at our world and says there was 3 times in the past where we see globalization take place, where the world, all that means is the world coming together in ways that it had not done previously. And he said the first one basically ran from 1492, when we have the story of Columbus, to about 1800. So kind of a lot of that history that you've been reading in world history and U.S. history that is a time period where we see globalization, the world coming together. The old world meets the new world. In many cases, didn't know the new world even existed and what was happening here. And look at all this nice stuff: gold, resources, geography. Boy, we redrew our maps and things like that when this happened. Um, so that coming together, creating trade networks. Those that were more powerful are able to survive and thrive. Those who are less powerful are exploited, taken advantage of. But then again, in some cases, end up with a higher standard of living at times because of their access to markets and things that they have not had access to before. So globalization, I think you're aware of that our world came together in a significant way during these years. Then you have the second period, which runs 1800 to 2000, maybe a few years before you were born. That era certainly characterized by large companies that wanted to get out of their geographic place, like here in the United States, and go other places where they could gain access to markets and people. They could sell their product in other places. They could, produce it cheaper maybe, and really just this company starts to become international as opposed to limited by borders. Okay, so I think that's the easiest way to say it. That's something you've always had. Like as long as you've been alive, those types of companies have made sense to you. Towards the year 2000, that's where the World Wide Web came into vogue, and certainly fiber optic cables, which was a big thing. I still remember hearing about fiber optic cables and everybody talking about how it was the new thing. I still remember what the first dial-up sounded like in our computers. And so I remember the world changing from what it was to what it is today, and how that looked and what that process was. And then the next step was from about 2000 until today, with a big difference being that individuals can compete globally today. Not corporations, they can, but individuals now are able to compete globally. So as high school students, we used to be told that, that person next to you, if they work harder than you, they're your competition and they can get that job that you want. So it's important for you to work hard. But now your competition is everywhere. That individual that's going to be your competition in the global market could be in a third world country. It could be as far away from here as you can imagine. That you essentially are competing with everybody today. So that's a big change that we've seen in the global market. Some ideas to think about: this world is flat. Everybody's competing with everybody. You know that probably close to 1 million U.S. tax returns, maybe more than that now, United States tax returns are being done in India. That people's accountants, this time of year, they bring their tax returns to their accountants hoping for a big refund. Their accountant may have an accountant who does that for them, and you're thinking they're doing it. They're actually outsourcing some of the easier stuff to another accountant that they pay a little bit more. And if that accountant is in India, they might be paying substantially less. And it might even worth their time to do your tax return because they can just outsource it there, and that individual will be more than happy to do that. Anything that can be digitized today, put in digital form, can be outsourced. If you go to a small or a medium-sized hospital, certainly Charlotte, Hungerford, and Torrington would not be a huge hospital, but do you know that a lot of times when CAT scans are read, so you have a CAT scan done for whatever reason, those CAT scans are actually read by doctors in Australia and doctors in India. They might not be even being read by doctors in small to medium-sized hospitals today. It's actually being done somewhere else. Reuters, which was a news organization, started to outsource its headline news. So think of it this way: if you're a reporter, you would go. Used to be you'd go to the scene of a news like this coronavirus. You'd go, maybe with Hartford behind you or somewhere. You'd talk to people. You'd report on what's happening in hospitals, and then you'd go back and you'd write the story, and it would be in the headlines of the Hartford Current the next day or whatever the newspaper might be. Today, what's happening is Reuters, as a news agency, is outsourcing the writing of the headline to maybe people in India. I'm going to keep using India because it's a hotbed of new technology and people working today in areas like this. So they will produce the headlines, and that takes all of that time, gives that time back, in other words, to that other reporter that may want to go focus on in-depth news stories of interest. where the headline news is being outsourced to places like India. And he talks about Friedman used to work for the United Press International. Said if they had figured that out a little earlier, it might have saved their jobs, their business, their company, if people had done that a little earlier. So today, companies, for instance, let's say that you fly, and if you've ever, I don't know if you ever, this has happened to you yourself, or you've heard this happening to other people, your luggage gets lost. Well, what happens now is there's some airlines that outsource things like that to people in India who will pick the phone up when you call to say, hey, where's my luggage? And they will deal with you there and help you through that process. Something like that. The other thing that's happened is JetBlue. There was a news story that ran several years ago that said JetBlue, if you were to call for an airplane flight, you wanted to go to a city and set that up, they actually outsourced that end of things to housewives who lived in Utah. Predominantly a Mormon population, wanted to keep mothers home with their children. And so what they would do for money is they would work right out of their home and receive the phone calls and work out your plane reservations for you within the confines of their own home. And what JetBlue found out was it was actually 30% more productive doing it this way. People were happy being in their homes. They worked harder, faster. I mean, that's for that business. But they said it was an amazing thing to see happen. The other thing is that these jobs, there's entire houses that are set up 24/7 businesses in India where their job is to work with people who might be experiencing technical difficulties with their computers. They call Dell or something like that, and the calls would actually come to this house. There may be I don't know how many workers, but 100 more in this house answering phones, trying to help people with their problems. And they're trained to speak the language, so they're ESL individuals. They're learning English as their second language. So part of their training involves learning how to speak with an American accent. We normally don't think of ourselves as having an American accent. Everybody else has got an accent, but actually a large part of the world thinks that we do. Certainly go to Great Britain and they'll tell you that they speak the proper form of English, and we're kind of something of a hybrid there. But the other thing that they'll do is they'll train them in that way to kind of learn the language. They even take different names to make Americans feel more at home. So what their name might be in India might now be Hillary or Cliff or Steve, or some American or British sounding name that people will automatically become more comfortable with. And you know that on a daily basis they get some of these companies get something like 700 applicants in India, and they can only hire about 6% of them. And the workers there are willing to work because in their country it gives them a pretty high standard of living, and they're able to kind of be somewhat well off by their standards to be employed in this area. And think about what's interesting. So think about a house like this. If maybe the house you're living in or wherever you live, if that were to be turned into one of these companies, well, you need air conditioning, you need telephones, you need all sorts of things. And what's happened is, even though these jobs you can say are being lost to India, the air conditioners, the telephones, the whatever else you have going on in the house, many times is being staffed with or American companies are producing the things that are in those homes. So the exports during, when you were little boys and girls, the exports to India doubled because these companies were opening up, and they were basically stocking them full of American products, even though the jobs themselves belonged to Indians. And so the other thing that happened was that, speaking of outsourcing, think of this, that even a place like Japan started outsourcing some of its jobs to China, which may surprise you because Japan and China have not had a real positive history with one another. But because of some of those interactions that they've had, there have been Japanese-speaking individuals that have stayed in China. So some of those regions in China are now regions where Japan can outsource and open up a business there with Japanese-speaking individuals, and it employs members in China that otherwise maybe wouldn't have a job. And so that has changed too, where that's happened. Outsourcing has also, I mean, think of this, drones that were hovering over some Iraqi cities during some military conflicts, were using drones to gather intelligence and some other things. A lot of those drones were being operated by somebody that's in Las Vegas. Maybe something you haven't thought about. And then the one that surprised me the most and stuck with me was this McDonald's in Missouri. People would drive up to this McDonald's, order their food. The order is not being taken by somebody inside the McDonald's in Missouri. Instead, this McDonald's in Missouri outsourced the ordering part to individuals that were actually in Colorado Springs, something like 900 miles away. We're actually taking your order for food, and then the people inside the McDonald's in Missouri would make your food. What they found out was, even though they tended to have to pay a little bit more for this process than they would pay for somebody inside the McDonald's to kind of do the order, they ended up making money by doing this because they were more efficient. They made less mistakes because there was only one part of the production chain that each person needed to worry about. So Friedman takes the first chapter to look at how the world was flat and things that maybe you and I don't really have a handle on, especially me, someone like you may have more than I do, just because I've lived a different way leading up to our increase in technology. But just opening your eyes to how the world is connected and where things are being made, how they're being outsourced, who your competition is. So the next part of this, in the next part of Friedman's book, he'll talk about the 10 factors that led to the world becoming flat, okay, where the playing field has been leveled. And so we'll kind of look at the first 5 of those in the next session. Also going back to Sasse's book, Them, we'll look at the next part of that too, about the idea of how to bring unity despite the division that we have in our country today. So that's it for today. Hopefully you had a chance to sit through all this. Hopefully it was interesting to you. I think it's important, even if it's not all that interesting at times. But if we can continue to do this, it'll be great. Hang in there. Hope you're making the most of this time. The other plan I have too, and I'll provide links to these books. But the other thing I'd like to do, I'm going to make some movie recommendations to you as well. Movies that you may not have seen that will kind of be worth your time, that you might be able to get on Netflix or Amazon Prime or one of those other services that you might otherwise not watch. So anyways, I'll do that, and again, make the most of the time. Keep rested, keep drinking fluids, things like that. We'll get through this, and I'm actually looking forward to getting back with you. But again, I'll continue to upload these, and take care. I'll see you soon.